Well, we're going to start looking at the material in chapter 12 now. And, in essence, what we're doing is we're extending our conversation of the role that financial leverage has in the profitability of commercial real estate. We'll consider returns and positive leverage and negative leverage, both at the before and after tax position. This is a little bit of a refresher. Financial leverage, the benefit of borrowing at a lower interest rate than the rate of return on the property. If you remember right, the total returns to the property are divided by those interests, right? The returns to the equity and the returns to debt. So if the returns to debt are higher than the returns to property, so in other words, if the interest rate that the financial institution is requiring is higher than the interest rate you can earn as a rate of return on the property overall, it doesn't make sense to borrow because you would actually reduce the returns that you would receive to the equity. Again, as a refresher, why do we use financial leverage? Well, for diversification, it frees up cash, we get a mortgage interest deduction, and it magnifies returns to the equity position. If I consider the unleveraged return on the property on a before tax basis, the relationship that I'm interested in then is this third major bullet here. The unleveraged BTIRR should be greater than the interest on debt. And as long as it is greater than the interest on debt, there will be what is referred to as positive leverage, which means that borrowing increases the returns to equity. And that should suggest to you that you would borrow as much as you can so long as equity's return increases or stays the same. And that's the theme of these slides and chapter 12 in general. We can look at that from a simple little equation relationship. So in this equation, I'll just arrow through it with you. The subs stand for equity, property overall, and then debt. So the BTIRR, or the before tax internal rate of return of equity, is equal to this relationship. Before tax IRR on property plus the differential between that on property and that on debt, divided by the debt to equity ratio, debt over equity. Okay? This shows, again, as I'm stating in this bullet, as long as the returns to the property exceed debt, then the returns to equity will exceed the returns to the property overall. And as I said earlier, this suggests that increasing the debt to equity ratio will yield positive results. So in other words, when you are thinking about a project, thinking about a purchase, and you go to the financial institution, if they have or offer latitude in the LTV or loan to value that they're willing to offer, you want to know what the interest rates are on the different loan to value thresholds. So in other words, you would inquire what a 70 or a 75%, an 80 or an 85% loan would cost you. Again, assuming that they would offer you that level of LTV. At each increase in loan to value ratio, of course, there's going to be a commensurate change in interest rates. The financial institutions, of course, are assuming greater risk when they offer higher LTVs, and they're going to expect to be compensated for that. By virtue of that, your interest charge goes up. So that positive influence that's afforded by the relationship between IRRE greater than IRRP will erode and eventually be gone. Not only that, of course, debt is limited, and it's limited, as I said, by the debt to equity ratio restrictions. Financial institutions, typically for commercial properties, will restrict the LTV to 75%. A higher LTV is also risky for the borrower, not just the lender. So the interest rates are higher from the lender's perspective, but it also adds risk to you because it creates very little latitude should you need to obtain cash or move assets around in a different fashion. So this is just illustrating when negative leverage occurs to make sure for people that like to see it visually for them. If the debt cost is higher than the return to the property, then the equity would be lower than the property overall. This is referred to as negative leverage. So in other words, borrowing more decreases the returns on equity. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because it's the same exact slide that we just saw, or the same exact formula that we just saw in equation 1. The only thing I've done is I've replaced the B with the A. So instead of being before tax, it's after tax. The same formula applies. What I wanted to do, and the reason why I've included both of these, is because I'm including this story about the break-even interest rate. And then we'll go a little bit slower on this one. This is a simple relationship that allows you and I to figure out what the maximum interest rate is before we reach a point of negative leverage. So in other words, what is the amount that we can borrow based on what the financial institution will charge before we move into that negative situation. So just running through it together. In that arrangement where we're right at the point where we would approach negative leverage, that would result in this equality, and that is the after-tax IRR, or the returns to debt, would exactly equal the returns to property. One more, say, BIP or point percentage above for debt, then that it decreases, or it makes it greater than the returns to property. And of course, that means that the returns to equity would be falling. If this is the case, we're going to tie those two together, the before tax and after tax IRR, in this relationship. So the after tax returns to debt are the same as the before tax returns to debt adjusted for the tax rate. If that's the case, then I can move this tax adjustment relationship around a little bit, put it underneath the ATIRR for debt, and I end up with this connection. So the before tax IRR to debt then is equal to the after tax IRR over this adjusted tax rate. And again, in this moment of equality, this would be the same as this, the returns to the entire property over that tax adjustment. A note that you'll see in the text, it should say that the break-even interest rate is not affected by LTV. But of course, that needs to be clarified, and I reflect back on what I just told you a minute ago, and that is, as you borrow more, you're going to face higher interest charges. And so with that in mind, the LTV does not directly affect the interest rate, but borrowing more results in a higher interest charge. All right, well, let's take a look at some of the elements that financial institutions use to underwrite commercial loans, and that information is what drives this interest rate that they're going to charge us. As I'm sure all of you are well aware, a commercial loan is handled very much like a residential loan in the context of figuring out what it's worth. So one of the early steps in the process is an appraisal. That's conducted by a third party, presumably someone that's independent and renders an estimate of value in an unbiased fashion. The appraisal will also be accompanied in many instances by a market study, oftentimes conducted by the borrower themselves. There are components of the appraisal that include market analysis, but oftentimes that's rather limited. In many commercial real estate transactions, borrowers, let's say you, for example, you will have to submit your financial statements. Those will include tax returns and information on wealth and so forth, and can sometimes get quite detailed. It also can get extremely cumbersome if you have multiple investor interests. So if you were to, for example, find 4 or 5 friends, get together and pool some money together and go out and get involved in investing in real estate, all of you are going to have to submit your financial statements because you are severally responsible for the debt. So in other words, each of you independently is responsible. You don't see them very often today, although I'm sure they're more prominent than they were during the recession. There may be a non-recourse clause in the loan, which says that in the event that you default on the mortgage, you do not have to surrender other assets in order to make the lender whole again. As you can see in my notes, if you have a non-recourse clause in a loan, it's similar to having a put option for the borrower. So the borrower can just basically, at any given time, say that this property is not performing up to snuff and get rid of it. And that's the reason why you don't see so many non-recourse loans anymore. Of course, they're also going to have some idea of what the loan-to-value ratio is going to be, and that's going to dictate what the debt coverage ratio is. And those are the two basic indices that they utilize, and as I pointed out earlier, those drive the property's ability to pay the mortgage, to service the debt. There might be some covenants, and I've just listed a few for examples. Lenders may play a role in approving new leases that you may wish to contract for. So, for example, on a lot of occasions, depending on the type of property, your quality of your tenants is important to the lender. So, as an example, if you are in the middle of purchasing or developing a retail space, you will typically be required to submit a rent roll that includes information on your tenants and the tenant quality. So let's say your anchor is Best Buy, just to throw something up. And then a year later, for whatever reason, Best Buy, much like Circuit City, a decade back, Best Buy goes bankrupt. And you're out seeking a new tenant, and you find some local appliance dealer to take their place. The lender would be a little bit uncomfortable with that new relationship simply because they would assume that that local tenant does not have the same credit paying capacity as a large national chain or international chain like Best Buy's. And so in many cases, you will see that they will want to have some sort of control over who you lease the space to, as well as modifying the leases, construction or new construction that may take place on the property. If there's rehabilitation to be done, of course, the lender will certainly be interested in that. And then some lenders require periodic updates of the financial performance of the property. So, for example, if you had a multifamily loan and you were able to obtain that loan through Fannie Mae, you have to submit annual financials on all of your properties that are under their umbrella. Additional covenants that might be include an annual appraisal update. All of the National Council Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries properties are appraised on an annual basis. It's not uncommon for a review of value and so forth. If there are legal problems, you're required to notify the lender in most cases. If you have property defects that need corrected, you should let them know, and in many cases, the lender has the right to visit the property at any time. The lender's goal, of course, is to ensure that after the loan is closed, that the property continued to produce the value that was originally estimated in that discounted cash flow analysis that we did at the beginning. There may be a lockout clause in the loan, and the lockout clause basically prohibits you from prepaying the loan for a period of time. In addition to the lockout clause, which prohibits prepayment for some specified period of time, there's also a yield maintenance fee. So the way these work out is let's say you have a 12-year note, all right? So for the first 5 years, you're not allowed to prepay it. I'm dreaming this up. At the end of the 5 years, what will kick in is what's known as a yield maintenance fee. So let's say that runs for another 5 years. And what that basically does is it protects the investor of the loan. So when you buy this commercial property, the bank gives you the loan. The bank sells that loan out on the market to investors. Investors are looking to receive the return that you've agreed to, the 6% per year, we'll say. In the event that you pay this loan off early, they have to redeploy that money. That comes at a cost. There's some transaction costs associated with that, of course, in addition to the reality that there's a strong possibility that interest rates are changing. So if interest rates are falling, now all of a sudden they have to redeploy their money and they're going to make less on that money. And so what a yield maintenance fee does is it requires you to pay as a prepayment penalty the outstanding interest charge that the investor would have received. And so that protects the investor. It's not something that necessarily completely locks you out from prepaying like a lockout clause. If you decide to put the property up for sale before the yield maintenance fee expires, you just pay the fee. Obviously, it's going to be based on what you anticipate being the property is going to return for you. So if you're in a hot market and it's gone up in value and it's worth paying the fee, then you would exercise your right to sell it, pay it off, and pay that yield maintenance fee to the investors. And of course, sometimes there's just a fixed fee for paying off early. Now, just to close this discussion, I'm going to give you just a couple quick examples that'll show you some spreadsheet type materials related to this debt and equity thing. So we're going to look at two. One is valuing equity interests at different rates, in that case, different mortgage rates. And then I'm going to take a look at the cash out option to selling. So if I'm in a position where I have to make a decision, one of the options I may have is to sell it at a certain rate of return, or I may have the option of refinancing the loan and taking cash out. And basically what that does, it allows me to buy additional properties while still retaining this one. So we're going to look at two different things. This one's a little bit busy, so just run through it with me. We're just going to walk through it together and show you the return variations just for an illustrative. So this property that I'm interested in has a base cost of $10 million. That's acquisition, research, and development cost, okay? So that's basically an all-in cost of $10 million. We estimate that the net income is $1 million. I'm using nice simple numbers for you and I for this particular case. And that's based on an estimated gross income of 1.4 and operating expenses, as you can see, of $400,000. As a reminder or refresher, the cash on cash return, i.e. the first year NOI over the original cost, is the 1 million over 10 or 10%. The relationship that we've struck up with the bank involves us putting 20% up. We're going to have an 80% LTV, so we're going to borrow 800,000 or 8 million, of that original total cost. What does it look like with different mortgage costs? And so what this illustration is showing you is I'm looking at it with a 6% mortgage and I'm looking at it with an 11% mortgage, okay? If you notice, these are interest-only loans, so the 8 million multiplied by the 6% gives me an annual debt service charge of $480,000. So the NOI after my debt service then is the 520 at 6%. The NOI after debt service at 11% is this 120 right here. The leverage return under those two scenarios is this 26% and 6% respectively, based on the $2 million that you and I have invested in the place. And so it gives you an idea of just a quick and dirty back of the napkin kind of way of looking at the returns to your investment based on what the financial institution is charging us for our loans. And again, remember, I've put 6% and 11% on there to show you the dramatic differences. But in reality, what we would probably do is compare different LTVs and different interest charges and compare the returns based on that. And that'll give us that positive versus negative leverage relationship that we talked about in the early slides. So another example I thought we'd run through together is this cash out example. It takes a couple slides to get through and a little illustration on Excel real quick. So in this case, the purchase price, as you can see, is $9 million. So we're going to buy this. We have some additional costs for acquisition to the tune of $200,000. We're going to rehab this place, so it needs work, right? As you can see, we put $300 in remediation, rehab, $4,050, and roads and utilities for a total of $4.55. We have some soft costs, so this is the acquisition, this is hard, and this is soft. And those soft costs include architects' fees, land use, i.e., local government costs and fees and licenses, and then the real estate broker's fees, and they're $750,000. It's going to take us 2 years to do this, and so what I'm doing is I'm charging us a carrying cost, right? So this is lost income, lost money, deferred cash flow by making this investment and spending the 2 years to get this all squared away. So 2 years from the time that we acquire it. My acquisition costs are going to have a carrying cost of 8%. As you can see, $1,472,000. The other costs, so the hard costs and the soft costs, are only going to last for 1 year. So we're assuming we're going to buy it, and then it's going to take us a year once we get everything settled to get it all going. And that's going to be 10% of those total costs. The total together, I'm sorry, I said it wrong to you guys earlier. The total together then is the 530. Tally all this up, and we end up with a total projected cost of 16,502. All right, so that's what it's going to cost us to get into this place, get it up to snuff, and get it ready to go. Once we get it finished, we anticipate gross income for 270,000 square feet of $18 a square foot, or as you can see, 4.9 mil. I have estimated our operating expenses at just under 1060, so 2860 for an NOI of $2 million. That's why it's 1059, as you can see. If we have NOI at $2 million, what's it worth when we get this thing all rehabbed, get it leased up, and we're generating income? What's the market going to pay for it? Well, I'm going to do my V equals NOI over R. My NOI is the 2 million. The R that I'm estimating for this property is 8.5%. So I end up with a value estimate of 23.5. As you recall, I'm sure, the project cost us 16.5 to build and rehab and acquire. And that includes, again, those carrying costs for letting that money sit idle. The potential profit then on sale is the 7 million. So if we sold it, a year or 2 years from the moment that we bought it, we would receive on sale $7 million. Is there an alternative to doing this? And that's what this example is all about. We could look at a cash out option. And it's going to be based on the debt coverage ratio that's required. So we're going to call the financial institution, okay? The financial institution told us that the debt coverage ratio that's required is 1.2. So we know that our NOI is $2 million. If I have a DCR, a debt coverage ratio of 1.2, that means I can afford on an annual basis a 1.65 mortgage commitment. The financial institution also told us that they would do a 25-year traditional amortizing loan at 6% if we had a DCR at 1.2. That tells us that the maximum amount that we can borrow on this property today is 21.3. Keeping in mind, we have 16.5 invested in it. How'd the 21.3 come about? Let me show you how we did that. Blow it up just a bit so you can see it better. So, using the bank's information, term was 25 years, interest rate 6%. The annual debt service, again, is the 1.650. And I'm going to answer the question, how did I get to the 21.3? Well, it's right here. Let's walk through it together, utilizing this formula bar. So, the interest rate, G7, divided by 12. The term, 25 years, G6, multiplied by 12. And then the payment. And remember, this is our annual debt service, but this is a 25-year amortizing mortgage, so we're going to make monthly payments. So it's G8, or the 1.650, divided by 12. And that gives us a present value of the 21.3, the cost, the amount of money that the financial institution is going to lend us. We originally paid, again, total all in, the 16.5 mil. The mortgage then, if we could obtain that at 21.3, would allow us to take cash out of this deal of $4.8 million. I didn't incorporate the story on the equity because we're not necessarily selling it at this point. We're just looking at the alternative to selling it. So you could sell it once it's leased up and organized at the $7 million net, or you could take the cash out of $4.8 million under this scenario and still retain ownership and make payments on that 21.3. Those are just a couple options for you to look at. Again, I'm providing these kinds of things along the way, and you'll see more and more of them as we go, just to kind of get you thinking about ways that this information may apply to things that you're interested in. You can find a property, do that sort of analysis, figure out what it might rent for, obtain estimates of operating costs, and run it out just the way I've just done this one. And with utilizing this and some of the other information and attempts at estimating value like DCF and so forth that we've looked at already. That's it for now. We'll be back next time with an assignment and moving into a story of risk in chapter 13.